Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Patti Peeples, and welcome to the next episode of Patty's People, sponsored by the Evidence Base. Today, my guest is Professor Mark Sculpher. Dr. Sculpher is the head of the Center for Health Economics at the University of York, and he is one of the most influential thinkers in health economics and health technology assessment across the globe. His work has shaped how the field thinks about cost effectiveness, opportunity cost, uncertainty, and equity. In a prior discussion with Mark, he argued that the core challenge with cost effectiveness is, in fact, not methodological, it's political. Our interview today is going to build on that conversation, and it's designed to explore both the intellectual architecture of HTA and the forces that determine whether evidence is actually changing policy. Welcome, Dr. Sculpher.
Thank you very much.
So, for decades, your work has helped the field answer a central question. How do we allocate finite health resources as fairly and efficiently as possible? Yet, many of the tensions that you've studied between evidence and politics, efficiency, equity, innovation, and affordability, they seem more visible than ever. So, is cost effectiveness analysis, if it was designed to bring discipline and transparency to difficult decisions, has it lost some authority or is it simply being selectively applied?
Well, I think the short answer to that is a bit of both. But I think it has been challenged, or at least the operation of cost effectiveness analysis in certain decision making contexts has been challenged. Uh, but also, um, I think it, it could be used more fully. It is used selectively. So, with respect to the first, then, the challenges I think are that inevitably resource allocation in health, and particularly in the context of the focus of much HTA, which is looking at um, commercially sponsored technologies like new medicines, is highly politicized. Um, uh, Essentially, we're determining um, which patients receive benefits, because for new medical technologies, typically, if one group of patients receive benefits, another can't. The so-called opportunity cost principle, and so that is inherently political, as well as the fact that the returns on investment in healthcare go to a range of different individuals and organizations, and that which will be heavily contested, which also makes it politicized. And cost effectiveness analysis and HTA more generally has been caught in the middle
Yeah.
of that. Um, and so the methods remain, I think, as valid as ever, but to make them work, a number of quite contested areas has to be resolved and agreed upon. And that has been, I think, an enormous challenge for governments and HTA bodies.
Do you think that's an answer that will ever be derived? And if we're having so much trouble with this and there's really no one universal answer to it, is it really politically sustainable?
It's a very good question. I think the sustainability issue is a more general one about spending on healthcare, and it has somewhat different versions, as it were, in different jurisdictions. Um, but it obviously relates to countries' fiscal positions, national debt, um, uh, cost of living for individuals, huge range of broader political issues. I think there's where the biggest consideration lies. But I do believe that there will be a continuation over time of state-funded um, uh, healthcare systems, whether they be universal, comprehensive type systems as in the UK, or part of a more diversified set of systems such as in the US. And in those systems, there's always going to be a need to determine the most appropriate use of resources, and to do that hopefully in an accountable and transparent way. So the problem doesn't go away. We still need to make those decisions, and to make those decisions well, but there is a broader set of really huge political challenges, which, well, I guess my confidence ebbs and flows as to whether we're going to be able to address them, but they're not going away.
Where is your confidence now? Is it in the ebb or the flow?
Well, we're in such a period of change, and you wake up one morning and things are completely changed from the previous evening. Um, uh, I, I'm feeling a little bit pessimistic at the moment for a range of reasons. We've had a major change in UK policy over here with respect to medicines pricing, and the government's commitment to increase to double as a percentage of GDP spend on new medicines, without any coherent empirical evidential basis of why they've done that. It's quite difficult to be optimistic about the role of independent health technology assessment in that context, let alone the broader issue about how, for the UK, we're going to make our National Health Service financially sustainable over the next 20 years.
Let's talk a little more about that. Your work on the marginal productivity showed that the National Health Service might generate health at a lower cost than implied by the NICE thresholds. What does that disconnect between the marginal productivity and the formal thresholds reveal about how value is actually determined?
Well, I think politically, over many years in this country, and in terms of national discussion, it's clear that the main benefit that the health system, that members of the public want to see from their health system, is around health. It's around health outcomes, expressed in different ways. Getting their hips fixed when they need it, getting good cancer care when they need that. And in that context, I think we're clear that we're trying to use NHS resources to improve individuals' health. When we're thinking about new investments, whether those be drugs, other types of technologies, surgical interventions, broader public health programs, we have to think about some sort of benchmark of value against which we can assess the costs and benefits of those new investments. And the cost effectiveness threshold, which as a concept, I think has only really been around for about, in terms of an explicit decision threshold, for about 25 years, sort of popped out of nowhere as a sort of a judgment call by HTA bodies. But now we do have that evidence that you mentioned, that many of us around the world believe has to be a huge consideration when you're investing in new technologies. That is, if we were to put that additional funding rather than in that new technology, if we put it into the health system more generally, at what rate what financial cost could we generate more health? And as you say, we're finding in the UK, 15,000 and below pounds per QALY is the sort of rate, sort of marginal cost of generating health generally in the health system. But the NICE threshold, well, until recently, was between 20 and 30,000 pounds per QALY. And in the context of the new so-called tariff deal with the US on medicines pricing, that threshold's been increased to 25 to 35,000 pounds per QALY. So we've got this major disconnect. I don't think this is an issue of value. The underlying evidence remains the same. What it reflects, I think, is a whole range of political considerations that relate, for example, to the challenge of the life science lobby, internationally, and particularly the pharma lobby, in making a strong case to governments about the need for prices to be higher to sustain and support further research and development, and the challenge that governments have of saying no to certain new technologies, not providing access to those interventions. So this is not an issue about value. This is an issue about the political context in which HTA operates, and the difficulty, at least in my country, but I think many others, that politicians face in being open and transparent and honest about the challenges of making difficult decisions regarding resource allocation in healthcare.
What would greater transparency reveal about the health being displaced?
Well, I think if there was more clarity about what opportunity costs are incurred when a new technology is recommended, is funded, reimbursed, whatever the system, that would help. So if decision makers were made aware that if you fund this new technology, then you'll generate this amount of benefits for those patients who receive it, but given its cost, this is an estimate of the benefits that other types of patients will have to forego as a result, then that may influence decisions, that sort of transparency. If in publicizing their decisions, HTA bodies and in relevant systems, governments were obliged to be transparent about those opportunity costs of their decisions as well at population level. So that's one of the things that standard HTA methods, I think, obscures, is that that everything's done at the average patient level. So the concept of the incremental cost effectiveness ratio and so forth. But actually, in some ways, this makes more sense at a aggregate population level. And the numbers have more meaning, I think, at that level.
Is there any appetite to recast the way that we look at internalizing opportunity cost from this healthcare decision-making perspective? And I think it sounds great on the surface. You've made a very good case for it, but I guess the other side of that is who would fund that research?
Well, that research is being funded, and that, again, I think in most high income settings, most highly developed societies, you have a source of research funding that isn't necessarily exactly what the government of the day will be funding. And that's a good thing, of course. And indeed, in this country, the very government who has struggled, I think, to make nice work well, is also funding that type of research on marginal productivity and opportunity cost. Because actually, it's not just the assessment of new medical technologies that those estimates help inform. They inform all kinds of other things. For example, they inform something about the level of funding of healthcare in the first place. They inform something about, again, in my setting, but there's comparable decisions in other countries, the balance between funding on healthcare, funding on what you'd call long-term care, what we call social care, and also public health, because they tend to come from different budgets. So there are a range of decisions they inform other than cost effectiveness thresholds. So I think and health systems are, and as they should be, very keen to understand something about how their productivity changes over time. So I think we won't see a reversal in the availability of that evidence. On the contrary, I think that sort of research is going on increasingly across different countries. And it will become, I think, more sophisticated. I hope that better data will become available to improve those estimates. So that's not going away. The question is whether there is the political appetite to use it more fully and more transparently in decision making.
HTA methods can probably only work optimally if, in fact, institutions are willing to say no to low value care. But that's often not the case, or they say no, but. Is the inability to say no to new technologies, is that a failure of the methodology, of political will, or is it indeed something structural?
I think governments and health systems, public health systems, always struggle to say no, and that has always been the case and will remain the case. And I think it does represent a really major challenge. But in the context of new medicines, the HTA systems in many countries, I think, have evolved. So in the UK with NICE, NICE did say no to a lot of things early on, but the political challenge that represented forced NICE really to change how it did its business. So, for example, in the case of treatments for ultra rare disease, that now has a separate program
Mhm.
with much higher cost effectiveness thresholds. The other thing that's changed is that there is a much more developed system of price negotiation. NICE wouldn't call it that, but that's what it amounts to. Essentially confidential discounts, such that the list price remains the same, and that's what has counted for international reference pricing. So that's the important consideration. But NICE has been very clear that the product would only be cost effective at a given price. And so NICE recommends 91% of those drugs that it reviews. But what's been a challenge for manufacturers is that they believe the prices are too low. And so they've argued over many years that those prices should be increased. And that's what's changed with the recent tariff deal with the
Mhm.
US. Um, in principle, a significant increase in prices and a major reduction in the amounts of rebates that companies provide.
Is there any concern that the rare disease cost effectiveness threshold will be a path that manufacturers seek with other types of new technologies? And in fact, if you play that scenario out, that then we would have different cost effectiveness thresholds for different types of medicines.
Mm. Well, NICE has in its what's called its highly specialized technology HST program, which is where these ultra rare treatments for ultra rare diseases are evaluated. There's always a push to get into that program. So there are a set of criteria that NICE uses to determine whether a given product gets into that program. And because it's a rather different framework in so many ways, but most notably on the basis of the cost effectiveness thresholds it uses. So to be clear, will go up typically to £100,000 per quality gain, but in the context of major improvements in health could go considerably higher. There's always a battle to get into that program. Companies will go to appeal if they don't get it, or oftentimes will go to appeal if they do not successfully get onto that program.
Mhm.
So as regards whether that would be generalized at all, well, NICE do have other variants in its activity, which in a sense provides some of that flexibility. So NICE has severity weightings, for example, for diseases that are considered to be significantly severe. Again, there is a weighting applied to the benefits of new treatments for those conditions, which in effect increases the cost effectiveness threshold. Um, uh, Apart from that, there's not been a pressure in this country to think about diseases separately.
Okay.
But I think in general, one could look at HTA bodies' activities across the world and see that they do have implicit, if not explicit, priorities. and they think about treatments for particular diseases and particular cancer, late stage cancer, differently to other types of disease.
So this is a natural follow-up to this then. Economic models assume that the decision makers behave as if they're optimizing a well-defined objective function, that we are reviewing the math, we are acting logically from an economic model standpoint. Are we simply building increasingly sophisticated models for systems that in fact don't really behave as assumed?
Mm. I think I would always argue that the models we develop do not imply that decision makers only use cost effectiveness, or even health as expressed by quality adjusted life years as the sole determinant of their decision. We know the decisions involve a whole range of other things. And so there is a deliberative framework in any decision-making setup, even those that use formalized cost effectiveness analysis and evidence synthesis. They will have other considerations. I'm very comfortable with that. The thing I'm not comfortable with is the extent to which that deliberation only goes in one direction. So if an intervention has failed a cost effectiveness test, there may be other criteria that are brought to bear to justify its funding, without a consideration of opportunity costs. Those deliberative considerations rarely, if ever, go in the other direction, i.e. something that's considered to be cost effective, but there may be other reasons why it's not suitable for funding. So it's always a case of pushing more and more interventions into the system, imposing more and more costs onto budgets which do not receive a commensurate improvement in outcomes that justifies those costs. In other words, we lose more health for other patients than we gain from the new technologies.
Is that a problem for our industry to solve, or is that a political problem?
I think it's a political problem. I
Okay.
think, and indeed it's for political scientists, I think, and perhaps some other social scientists to explore some of these issues. I think there are lots of interesting issues at an organizational level, about how different parts of governments and their agencies evolve over time politically. So NICE, that's essentially at arm's length from government, but is independent of it in its decision making, has, I think, evolved in a way that indicates that either from government or from the industry itself, most likely both, it has become more generous in its decisions over time. And it's not difficult to see why that is. I mean, life science is a very strong lobby, one, and governments that are increasingly desperate to generate growth in as many ways as they can are extremely conscious of the potential role that life sciences plays in that growth strategy. So you get this pincer movement, really, I think. Government on one side, industry on the other, and the HTA bodies in the middle. It's not surprising that they bend with that political pressure over time. I think it takes a lot of political bravery, courage to take a clear, principled line on this. Interesting as to whether countries without a significant domestic pharmaceutical R&D industry behave differently. I think Pharmac in New Zealand is often cited as an organization where they're able to take a very consistent line on value for money, because they just don't have that domestic industry to the same extent. But it's understanding those trade-offs, I think, which is critical at the moment. And in other words, in justifying higher prices for pharmaceuticals on the basis that it's in some way supporting life science investment, inward investment, and so on, what is the evidence? On what basis do we make those, to assess those trade-offs? Because the so-called tariff deal that has recently been done on drug prices in this country is extremely difficult to understand how the government made those numbers add up, and they have not released to the public their impact assessment of that policy change. But the analysis that's been done by academic groups suggests that we lose much more than we're likely to gain.
So let's talk about sharing in the spoils of new technologies. Healthcare systems, manufacturers, and patients are all accruing benefits ideally from new technologies. But let's focus specifically on manufacturers and the health systems. Is there a fair distribution of value between those two groups, manufacturers and health systems? And how should prices reflect that there are incentives for this?
Hmm. Well, it's an interesting area that I think has only recently been researched. We've looked in this country at how the total value of new medicines is shared between manufacturers and between patients. And when I emphasize total value, I'm talking here about long-term value, not just the period of the patent, but beyond that, when prices tend to go down, if we see generics and biosimilars enter the market, but also the sort of knock-on value as new products come into the market. As long as they are priced relative to the previous ones, you get a sustained benefit from the earlier products. So this can be sustained for many years. When we look at how that long-term value is shared out, we see that for many products, the manufacturers, this is many products that are evaluated by NICE and approved by NICE, the share of the value going to manufacturers is often above 100%. Now, this rests crucially on the fact that we have this disconnect that we were talking about earlier between NICE's cost effectiveness thresholds and marginal productivity of the health system, so-called opportunity cost. But it's not true of all products. So interestingly, products of a more preventive nature, so where you have initial expenditure but longer term benefits, that's much less the case, much lower share in those situations, and that's somewhat dependent also on the discount rate that's used by NICE. So, but in general, those shares of values are higher in favour of the manufacturers and very often over 100%. Begs the question, well, what percentage share should there be? What is a fair share? And that's in the context of a manufacturer that has a patent on a product. What the patent's doing is conferring a monopoly price for a period of time, 10, 12, 15 years. So it can earn monopoly profits to incentivize future research. In the case of a system like the NHS and many other sort of national universal systems, they are monopsonists and have the ability to push prices down. And therefore the question is, well, what does a good citizen health system do? One that is not only interested in getting drugs for the lowest possible price, but also interested in paying its fair share. And we've done research that's looked at the international literature on that tries to explain how much future R&D is undertaken as a function of changes in manufacturers' revenue. So that relationship between those two variables. And although that's quite an uncertain estimate, our research has indicated that somewhere about 26%, 25-26% of long-term value would need to be given to manufacturers for the UK to incentivize research appropriately or
Okay.
fairly.
So if they earn more than 26% of an investment, then they are incentivized to continue investing in something.
Or at 26. So approximately 26 would be a fair share of
Mhm.
long-term value for a health system to give to manufacturers of new medicines.
Mhm.
And that can be provided in all kinds of ways. It could,
Yeah.
it opens up a possibility of a very different way of thinking about paying for drugs in health systems like the NHS. It doesn't have to just be a price change.
Right.
It could be essentially
Tax
uh,
incentive. Yeah.
Netflix type arrangements where
Mm.
you essentially you pay for access to a drug over time. It could be prices with rebates, a whole range of different approaches. But that transparency around share of value, we would argue, should be fundamental to any pricing system. But
Mhm.
we're a long way from that at the moment.
Yeah, I'm sure that went over like a lead balloon, right?
Yeah, I think it was understood by, I think it's understood to be a helpful way of thinking about pricing, but clearly it's heavily contested uh, around, again, that issue of the threshold versus the marginal productivity. But also, you have to take a view on whether manufacturers would simply refuse to launch their products in the UK in that context. It, 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 for most products, it would pay manufacturers to launch in a country like the NHS as long as the price they're receiving is above the marginal cost of production, right? They're still making money.
Mhm.
So any refusal to launch really is about taking a stand with a view to affecting a political change, to
Yeah.
stopping that particular arrangement. And governments, I think, are rarely willing to stand up to manufacturers on that
Mhm.
basis.
Mhm. Because of all the other impacts that it would have on the total economy of the country.
Yeah, and just well, only if you believe that if the manufacturers would indeed withdraw or fail to launch,
Mhm.
they would of course be cutting off their nose to spite their face doing so because they're losing money. Um, but they are, the politics of taking a strong line on that basis, I think, are really difficult from countries. It's, manufacturers are a strong lobby, and particularly where you've got a domestic industry.
So we're talking about uncertainty in a slightly different way than we typically think about uncertainty in a cost effectiveness model. But you have helped pioneer the value of information methods, yet they're underused. And these relate to quantifying uncertainty. What are some of the advanced methods for uncertainty quantification that are underused, and why do you think they are underused?
But I think the challenge with uncertainty is, I mean, firstly, the things we should recognize is that every decision about a new medical technology, including new pharmaceuticals, involves often quite significant amounts of uncertainty.
Mhm.
Uh, we we now see more products, more pharmaceutical products, go to regulators without randomized trials, but with, for example, single arm trials using historical controls. That's just one example of how we've seen this increase in the evidential uncertainty that faces HTA when the drugs are submitted to those organizations. So it's not going away, and indeed, in many ways, it's increasing. The question is, how do we reflect that in decision making? And I think there's perhaps in my community, academics work in this field have been rather too focused on fancy technical solutions to how we quantify uncertainty
Mhm.
and and how we present it without enough consideration given to how decision makers reflect uncertainty
Mhm.
in their deliberations.
Mhm.
If so, if you're a decision maker who can only basically say yes or no to a drug, they have no ability to change the price, they have no ability to ask for further research or to do further research, they have no scope to enter sort of risk sharing agreements with manufacturers, then there's not an awful lot they can do other than just simply base their decision on the expected value of cost effectiveness. What on average is this treatment cost effective? But of course, many decision makers do have more scope to react to uncertainty in different ways. So one is price reductions, and that's something that NICE has done over recent years. When they believe uncertainty reaches a certain critical threshold, it will reduce its cost effectiveness threshold. Sorry, the use of the term threshold in two different ways there. If it considers uncertainty to be particularly high, it will reduce its cost effectiveness threshold. But it doesn't, but that's a somewhat arbitrary process. There's no clarity about at which point something becomes too uncertain. In other contexts, we have sort of what we would call in this country managed entry, where products are allowed onto the market in a particular way with a particular price, whilst additional evidence is generated. After which there's a reassessment. So there are, but again, the use of analysis, including value of information analysis, to inform those types of decisions is pretty rare. So there is this disconnect about, we have a set of possible policy responses. We also have a number of sort of methods we use to quantify uncertainty, but there is a disconnect in the use of those latter methods in making decisions. And as part of the Health Economics Methods Advisory Group that I chair, which is funded by ISA, NICE and CDA in Canada, we're looking at this topic at the moment. That's our second topic, to try and come up with some sort of guidance as to how we can reflect uncertainty more fully in our analyses, but crucially, how we link them to potential decisions.
So also looking at how operationally that analysis may be more of a common component of the decision.
Yeah, that they become more decision relevant. That decision-making organizations can more formally, I suppose, use the uncertainty analysis to help them figure out the best policy response for a particular product.
Let's talk a little bit about efficiency versus equity. So distributional cost effectiveness analysis makes the trade-offs between total health and fairness more explicit. How should health systems balance this maximizing health versus reducing inequality? I guess what I'm asking is, should those equity concerns be formally embedded, or should they be handled separately by decision makers?
Well, it's a good question. In this country, our NHS is formally responsible for addressing health inequalities. So it has a requirement to do that. The challenge, I think, for all health systems is the extent to which they really can impact significantly on inequalities, and particularly drugs, right? So it's actually, in general, with a few exceptions, new pharmaceuticals don't really impact on inequalities, other than the fact that through displacement, through opportunity costs, they might do so. So if there's a big net opportunity cost of the funding of a new intervention, that can actually increase health inequalities. But in general, there's not a big impact. Where we get the potential impacts on health inequalities are for other types of public programs, so public health interventions, but also more generally around welfare policy, social policy, housing, and so forth. So I'm a little bit skeptical about building it in routinely, to be quite honest. But the question, but for those systems that do that, we do have the methods to hardwire it in to our economic evaluations. But to make it work properly, it needs to be consistent. It needs to be for all technologies, not just those. So the current NICE approach is essentially they'll only use this distributional cost effectiveness analysis when the manufacturers think it's to their advantage.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's the wrong thing to do. I think it needs to be used consistently, if at all. But ultimately, if there's a trade-off, so for any intervention which might actually reduce population health on average because it's not cost effective, but it could it could reduce inequalities. When we've got that trade-off situation, we need to be explicit about how we make that trade-off. And there's research in many countries about how the public make that trade-off, that sort of inequality aversion, as it's called. Again, I think that's there as a set of tools, but the question is, politically again, when will those trade-offs be acceptable or not acceptable? So you can imagine, I think, a situation where a treatment's not cost effective based on usual cost effectiveness analysis, but it may be considered good value using distributional cost effectiveness analysis. I think that would be fairly straightforward to result in a positive decision. But the other way round, treatment's cost effective, but it actually increases health inequalities. The decision not to support it, I think, will be very difficult.
What would be an example of something that wasn't cost effective, but from a distributional cost effectiveness standpoint, it was?
Well, again, with pharmaceuticals, it's very difficult to think of anything. But in the world of screening, so population screening would be one way you might see that. So we know that those individuals who are least likely to present themselves to public screening tend to be the most disadvantaged, on average. So you could have a screening program which is cost effective in general, but because of that gradient, that social class gradient in who presents to that system, to that screening system, you may actually increase health inequalities. So there's been a range of work in the screening area around that type of trade-off.
So NICE began with a clear logic, but it's added a lot of exceptions and accommodations along the way. Do you think that NICE has adapted appropriately, or is it possible that they've compromised their core logic?
Um, I think, again, there's a bit of both. I think some of the things it's developed over the years, particularly around methods, have been appropriate. So I'm thinking, for example, a more standardized approach to health state preference utilities using the EQ5D, which has recently been updated. I think those sorts of methods developments are appropriate, as are some of the uncertainty analyses they supported. And they've developed a very rigorous approach to thinking about comparators. But I think in the broader framework about how analysis supports decisions, I think some of those changes have been problematic. I think I have a lot of problems with how the issue we talked about earlier with respect to very rare conditions has been dealt with. I understand politically why that is, but I think, again, the opportunity costs of those decisions are not sufficiently transparent. I think the decision to move to single technology assessments back in, I think that was about 2008, which has basically removed some of the independent modeling and analysis undertaken by independent academic groups, was a step backwards as well. And of course, I think my colleagues and many academics would argue that their refusal to bring their threshold down closer to something reflecting opportunity costs has been problematic. They would argue, I've heard them many times to do so, that actually they have been working really hard to even maintain the position rather than having it pushed up, which was the case until very recently. So, as we were discussing earlier, NICE doesn't operate in a political vacuum. It is constantly buffeted by those political challenges, both from the industry and from government. And I think there's some variation in opinion amongst academics about, whether they sympathize with NICE or not. In general, my view would be that NICE has rightly developed a strong international reputation for the work it does. Its process of assessment, I think, is very strong. So critically reviewing company submissions, establishing the nature of the evidence and its reliability and uncertainties, that's all done really well. The challenge is then linking that to a decision, and principally to a value-based price. But that is what the area that is so heavily politicized. It's difficult to know quite how NICE could have navigated that differently.
Let's talk a little bit about ISPOR and policy influence. So, over the 2+ decades that ISPOR has been in existence, it's become a methodologic powerhouse. Certainly, that tenet has run strong through its years. Recently, there has been some attempt to be more engaged in a policy forward approach, but I think it would be fair to say that it's still pretty uneven. Do you think that ISPOR should play a role in shaping healthcare pharmaceutical policy? And should they be more willing to challenge policy decisions publicly?
I think ISPOR and other organizations like Society of Medical Decision Making have a really important role in helping to sort of what we over here will call knowledge exchange, to translate science into materials and resources that policymakers can understand and find valuable to support their decisions. But that's a somewhat different role to one where they are trying to shape policy and critically review policy. I think, of course, it's entirely reasonable for individuals and groups to do that. I think the challenge for ISPOR is that it represents, it's a member organization, and those members have a range of different views about the appropriateness of policy and how it's conducted. And coming up with a consensus position within a society like that is very difficult. I think personally, too often ISPOR reflects the fact that it's located in the US, so most of its focus is on considerations that are prominent in the US. We saw that, I think, for example, with the so-called value flower, and of course, ISPOR has a lot of membership of people from the commercial sector, from pharma and other life sciences, whose opinions, of course, are entirely legitimate. But managing that heterogeneity of viewpoint, I think, can be quite difficult when you're trying to influence policy.
If not them, who?
Well, I think in a pluralistic society, I think everybody, through various routes, us as academics, through political parties, through civil society in various ways, should be inputting into critical review of policy. And I'm not suggesting ISPOR shouldn't do this. I think it's just difficult to do it well and to do it fairly. And I would argue, I have argued that it needs to try and be more international in how it thinks about policy and policy priorities, and needs to try and provide as much opportunity as possible for the range of opinions that ISPOR membership reflects to be expressed. I think it does try hard to do that. It's just a difficult undertaking.
Let's move into the rapid fire now. So
Okay.
short answers, one word or short responses. Some of our ideas absorb a lot more attention than they probably deserve. What's one concept in HTA or health economics that we overestimate?
Uh, I think that's the concept of wider value beyond health. I think we
Okay.
worry too much about that in HTA and trying to reflect that.
Too many petals on the value flower?
Absolutely.
And then on the converse, other ideas remain underappreciated despite their importance. What is one concept that we are underestimating?
Well, I think we've talked about that extensively today. Opportunity cost, I think, is the key thing
Yeah.
on that one.
Mark Opportunity Cost Sculpher.
That'll be on my gravestone. Yeah, absolutely.
So every mature field has some uncomfortable truths. I wouldn't call HEOR a mature field yet, but we have certainly come a long way in 30 plus years. What is something, in your opinion, that the next generation should not inherit?
Well, I think ultimately it's about, I think we have to learn to be humble. Uh, John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, uh, extolled the virtues of dentists because he considered they were humble, and social economist was his line. So this is not a quick
Oh,
fire
yeah.
response, but I think we have to realize that we work in a political field, and sometimes we can't develop technical responses to what is ultimately a very political set of considerations. So I think it's about being humble for what we can do to inform decisions without thinking that we can determine decisions.
What idea has changed most for you and how you think about healthcare?
I think I think the thing I've thought about more recently is the complexity of what I would call multi-sectoral impacts of healthcare interventions, and how we handle that. So I think, and I said earlier that we don't think enough, that value is expressed too widely. I think that often is the case for medicines and other health technologies. But for many healthcare decisions, or particularly around public health
Mhm.
interventions, those multi-sectoral effects should be reflected more appropriately.
Mm.
But we don't have the tools, we haven't traditionally had the tools to do it. So that's, I think, an area that I would take forward and want to develop further.
What publication or public policy influence are you most proud of?
Um, I think that would be, I think my contributions to the Drummond et al. Blue Book, actually, of economic evaluation, would be something I'm most proud of. I think those stand up as being huge contributions to our field and have been a core source of learning for thousands of people developing their skill sets in this area. So I would rate that pretty highly.
Could not agree more. What do you believe today that you would not have believed 20 years ago?
Um, I'm going to sort of turn that around by putting it in the negative. I don't believe economic evaluation is the be all and end all of decisions.
Mhm,
20 years ago, I would.
mhm.
Um, I think that that broad political context we've been discussing has been a critical factor in my realization that I've become more fully aware of that political environment in which our work exists, and realize now that we have to be a little bit more realistic about its impact.
So, a natural next step then is what would you tell a young researcher today who wants to influence policy?
Keep keep your eye on the bigger picture. I mean, I think it is something about a experience in research. I can remember a senior colleague of ours here at York, Tony Collier, who was the inaugural vice chairman of NICE, has been hugely influential in this country in HTA. He used to tell us off for being too obsessed with the minutiae of technical methods. Tying pretty bows is how he expressed it. And as time's gone on, I realized how right he was, that you need to not obsess about some of the technical detail. You need to keep a big picture about how your research can influence policy and influence change.
I often thought that if I was in a professor position and I had a young graduate student coming to me, the the challenge that I would give them is to randomly select 100 health economics papers and read the limitations section, and then think about what that could suggest to them is where our field needs to go.
Very true. Yeah, very true.
They all read almost identical regardless of the type of research, and they have since 1987 when I started doing this work.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, what are you reading right now, Mark? Either professionally or non-professionally?
yeah. Well, I'm actually reading Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, which is one of essentially the first biography, at least as we would recognize it. Samuel Johnson was a literary figure in the 18th century in the UK, and Boswell was his friend for life, and he's written this extraordinary biography, and a vivid evocation of 18th century London. So very much unrelated to my work, to be quite honest.
Sounds totally delightful. All right, do you have any final thoughts?
I think not. No, I think we've covered a whole range of areas. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. This has been so interesting. I could literally talk with you about this for a nice long while. And I want to thank you for being so willing to devote your time to this, so open and thoughtful in your responses. And I want to just tell you how much I appreciate the chance to sit down with you.
Thank you very much.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Mark. Safe travels as you
Thanks.
fly around the world, and I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your summer.
Thanks a lot. Good to speak.
You